Hi students, today let's learn agents of pollination. Let's see what are the agents of pollination. There are four agents of pollination. Number one, entomophily. Number two, anemophily. Number three, hydrophily. Number four, ornithophily. Entomophily. What is entomophily? Pollination by insects. Anemophily, pollination by wind. Hydrophily, pollination by water. Ornithophily, pollination by bird. These are the four agents of pollination. Let's see what is entomophily. The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower. To the stigma of another flower is called entomophily. What is entomophily? The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower is called entomophily. Now when this takes place? When an insect visits the flower to suck the nectar, or sometimes it wants to protect itself from the rain, heat or cold. Sometimes it wants to lay eggs. These are the times they visit the flower. So while performing this activity, they also perform the pollination. From the anther, it carry the pollen grains to the stigma of another flower by insect. Insects, when they come to or when they visit the flower to suck the nectar or to protect themselves or itself from the rain, heat, cold, or sometimes to lay eggs, they visit the flower. While performing this activity, they also perform the pollination. What are the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers? Number one, beautiful, showy and bright colored corolla. Insect pollinated flowers, petals are bright in color and they are very beautiful and they are attractive. Sweet scented floral parts. Insect pollinated flowers parts are very smelly. Okay, they have very good smell, very sweet smell they have. Small flowers, they are usually small in size. Presence of nectar glands. Insect pollinated flowers have nectar in them, so that insects can go and suck the nectar. That is how pollination takes place by insects. Then production of edible pollen. Insect pollinated flowers have plenty pollen grains in them. Then sticky nature of pollen grains and stigma. Insect pollinated flowers stigmas are sticky. Not only stigma, pollen grains are also. Pollen grains and stigma both are sticky, so that insect can carry this pollen grains to the stigma. Pollen grains are sticky. So when insects comes to suck the nectar from the flower, these pollen grains will stick to their legs. and when they go to the other flower and when they go to the stigma of other flower, even stigma is sticky so that these pollen grains can stick to stigma. Example, sunflower and marigold. These are the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. The common insects which help in pollination the common insects which help in pollination are bees, flies, moths, butterflies, beetles. These are the common insects which help in pollination. These are the most common pollinators, or these are the most common insects which help in pollination. Second agent is anemophily. First one we learned endomophily. Now second one is anemophily. What is anemophily? The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower through the agency of wind. We learned endomophily is pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma by insect. This is by wind. The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower through the agency of wind. We'll see what are the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. Number one, absence of nectar. There is no nectar in wind pollinated flowers. Number two, flowers are colorless, odorless and not showy. Wind pollinated flowers are colorless. They don't have that bright color, and odorless. Odorless means there is no sweet smell in them, and not showy. They are not that attractive, or we don't feel like to look at it again. Such kind of flowers they are. And then absence of calyx and corolla. There is no calyx and corolla. Plants generally grow in groups. These kind of plants generally grow in groups. Pollen grains are light and dusty. These wind pollinated flowers, pollen grains are light and dusty. Then only wind can carry them. Abundant production of pollen grains because of high wastage. There is chance for high wastage. That is why this kind of flowers, pollen grains production is high or abundant. Okay, too much of or plenty pollen grains are there in them, so that few can get into pollination. Okay, so there is high chance for wastage. There is chance for high wastage. So abundant production of pollen grains in this kind of flowers. Then stigmas are hairy and well exposed to catch wind-borne pollen. What are the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers? Absence of nectar. Number one, absence of nectar. There is no nectar in this flowers. Then flowers are colorless, odorless and not showy. In wind pollinated flowers, these flowers are colorless. They are not that bright in color. Odorless means they don't have smell, and not showy. They are not that attractive. Absence of calyx and corolla. There is no calyx and corolla. Plants generally grow in groups. This kind of plants usually grow in groups. Then pollen grains are light and dusty. Pollen grains are light and dusty. Then only wind can carry them. Abundant production of pollen grains because of high wastage. There is chance for high wastage, So abundant production of pollen grains are there in wind pollinated flowers. Means plenty pollen grains are there in such flowers. Stigmas are hairy and well exposed. This flower stigmas are hairy and they are well exposed so that they can catch the wind-borne pollen. These are the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. Example of wind pollinated flowers: wheat, maize and grass. Third point is hydrophily. It is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower through the agency of water. Through the agency of water. Example, Hydrilla vallisneria. What is hydrophily? It is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower through the agency of water. Through the agency of water. That is called hydrophily. Example, Hydrilla and vallisneria. Let's see what are the characteristics of water pollinated flowers. There are three characteristics. Number one, pollen grains are long, filamentous, unwettable and swim under the water. Water pollinated flowers pollen grains are long, filamentous. Filamentous means they are thin and flexible thread-like object. Okay, and they are unwettable, and then they swim under the water. Then second point is the male flower gets detached and float on the surface of the water. Third one, stigma of the flower is large, sticky and well exposed. These are the three characteristics. Okay. Now, the male flower gets detached. Second point says the male flower gets detached and float on the surface of water. When they get detached, once they are matured, the male flower is matured, then they get detached from the plant and then float on the surface of the water. Now, stigma of the flower is large, sticky and well exposed. This is about female flower. Female flower stigmas are very large and then they are well exposed and sticky too. Okay. Now the male flower gets detached and then float on the surface, and then they come in contact with the female flower. When they come in contact with the female flower, this male flower will drop or shed the pollen grains into stigma of female flower, and that is how pollination takes place. The fourth agent of pollination is ornithophily. It is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower through the agency of bird. That is what? Ornithophily. Okay, it is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower through the agency of bird. Example, Canna, Begonia, Bombax. If you like my video, please like, share and subscribe. Press the bell icon to stay tuned.